What if the man who once stood in front of the world and said he would protect his wife at all costs just admitted he can't do it anymore? That's the question that hit the UK like a thunderclap. Not whispered, not leaked through tabloids, not buried in speculation, but spoken plainly, with a finality that felt almost unreal. Prince Harry, divorcing Meghan, for words that seemed impossible only a short time ago. And yet, here we are. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, the narrative was fixed. Us against them. A love story forged in pressure, strengthened by criticism, sealed by sacrifice. When Prince Harry walked away from royal life, the world was told it was for love. When bridges burned behind him, it was framed as necessary. When family ties frayed, it was presented as the cost of choosing happiness. And through it all, one thing felt unbreakable: the marriage. Until now. Because this announcement didn't just surprise casual observers. It stunned people who had followed every interview, every documentary, every carefully chosen word. People who believed that no matter how chaotic everything else became, that relationship was the one thing Harry would never let go of. So what changed? Think about the timing. Not at the height of scandal, not during the loudest media frenzy, but now, quietly, deliberately. Almost as if something behind the scenes reached a point of no return. Ask yourself this: do people usually end the most defended relationship of their lives on impulse? Or does it happen after a long, silent unraveling? Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because divorces like this don't start with lawyers. They start with moments. Small ones. A sentence that lands wrong. A realization that refuses to go away. A night where sleep doesn't come, not because of the noise outside, but because of the thoughts inside. And once that internal shift happens, everything you've been protecting suddenly feels heavier than what you're protecting it from. The UK reaction wasn't just shock. It was confusion. Even those critical of the couple paused. Even supporters went quiet. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. This was the one constant. The proof that the sacrifice meant something. So if that's gone, what was it all for? And then there's the question no one wants to ask out loud. If the marriage couldn't survive after everything Harry gave up, what does that say about the cost of the fight itself? About the pressure of living permanently on defense? About what happens when a love story has no space left to just be human? Some say this announcement is about freedom. Others say it's about failure. But what if it's neither? What if it's about something far more personal, far more unsettling? The moment Harry realized he no longer recognized the life he was living. Because before this announcement reached the public, something happened behind closed doors. Something that didn't involve cameras or headlines. And once you understand what that was, the divorce itself may not be the most shocking part of this story. They weren't just fighting the world anymore. They were fighting each other. That's the part most people never see. When a marriage becomes a symbol, it stops being private. Every argument feels historic. Every disagreement feels political. Every compromise feels like surrender. And for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the marriage didn't just exist between two people anymore. It existed between headlines, documentaries, lawsuits, public opinion, and a never-ending need to explain themselves. At first, the tension looked like unity. Us against the world. That kind of bond can feel intoxicating, powerful, like nothing can break it. But here's the contradiction no one talks about. When a relationship is built entirely on resistance, what happens when there's no room left for peace? Think about it. Every interview became a defense. Every public appearance carried subtext. Every silence sparked speculation. The marriage wasn't just about love anymore. It was about proving something. Proving critics wrong. Proving sacrifices were justified. Proving the exit was worth it. And that kind of pressure doesn't disappear when the cameras turn off. It follows you home. It sits at the dinner table. It sleeps in the same bed. People close to high-conflict relationships often describe them the same way. Exhausting, even when there's love. Especially when there's love. Because love makes you stay longer than you should. Love convinces you that endurance equals success. Love whispers that if you just push a little harder, things will finally settle down. But what if they never do? Over time, cracks don't announce themselves loudly. They show up as irritation where patience used to be. Silence where conversation once flowed. A growing sense that you're constantly managing reality instead of living it. And for Harry, whose entire life was already shaped by duty and expectation, The irony became hard to ignore. He left one rigid structure only to find himself inside another. Ask yourself this honestly. How long can two people survive when their relationship has no neutral ground? When every moment feels like it's either a battle or a briefing? When there's no space to be wrong, tired, or unsure without consequences? There's a reason people say pressure doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you are. And what pressure began revealing wasn't pretty. Not because either side was evil or broken, but because the situation demanded something no relationship can sustain forever: permanent defense mode. Here's the emotional twist. From the outside, it looked like unwavering loyalty. From the inside, it may have felt like erasure. When everything you do is framed as standing by someone, where does your own voice go? Where do your doubts live? Where does your exhaustion get permission to exist? And that's when the marriage reportedly shifted from partnership to battlefield. Not loud fights, not dramatic scenes. Something quieter, more dangerous. A growing realization that staying together was starting to cost more than separating ever could. But this wasn't the moment Harry decided to leave. Not yet. Because what finally pushed him toward that announcement wasn't the fighting, or the pressure, or even the loneliness. It was a single moment that reframed everything he thought he was protecting. And once that realization landed, there was no going back. What if the moment that changed everything wasn't loud at all? What if it was quiet enough to miss, but heavy enough to end a marriage? Because according to how these stories usually unfold, the breaking point rarely comes during chaos. It comes after, when the noise fades, when the defenses drop. When someone finally stops arguing and starts listening to a thought they've been pushing away for years. This chapter doesn't begin with a fight. It begins with stillness. Imagine carrying a belief so long that it becomes part of your identity. I did this for love. I gave this up for us. I lost this because it mattered. And then imagine that belief suddenly wobbling. Not collapsing all at once, just cracking. A single contradiction. A single moment where the story you've been telling yourself no longer fits the facts in front of you. People close to high-pressure relationships describe it the same way. One comment lands differently than it should. One reaction feels off. One memory resurfaces and refuses to stay buried. And suddenly, you're no longer defending the relationship automatically. You're evaluating it. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you realized you were arguing out of habit rather than conviction? For Harry, that shift is said to have been deeply unsettling. Because his role for years had been clear. Protect, defend, absorb the criticism, take the hits. And that role gave him purpose. But purpose can quietly turn into a prison when it no longer aligns with your inner truth. Here's where the contradiction sharpens. The more he tried to make things work, the more he reportedly felt himself shrinking. Not disappearing dramatically, but slowly. His opinions softened. His doubts went unspoken. His instincts were overridden by the need to keep the structure intact. And that's the moment many people in long, strained relationships recognize too late. When maintaining peace requires constant self-editing, resentment doesn't explode. It accumulates. There's a cruel irony here. The same loyalty that once made Harry admirable may have delayed the realization that something was fundamentally wrong. Loyalty can blind you. It can convince you that endurance is the same as fulfillment. That staying is proof of strength. Until one day, staying feels like avoidance. And then comes the question no one can answer for you. Am I still choosing this? Or am I just afraid of what leaving would mean? That question doesn't arrive gently. It arrives at 3 a.m. It arrives during silence. It arrives when you realize you've been explaining your life more than living it. And once that question takes hold, it changes how you see everything that came before. Suddenly, past sacrifices look different. The distance from family, the public battles, the years spent in defense mode. Not meaningless, but heavier. More complicated, and perhaps no longer justifiable in the same way. This wasn't about blame. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about recognition. About realizing that love, when forced to carry too much symbolism, can stop feeling like love at all. But here's the part that truly unsettled Harry. Once he allowed himself to question the marriage, another thought followed immediately. A more dangerous one. If he had been willing to give up everything else for this relationship, what had the relationship actually given back? And that question didn't just threaten the future. It threatened the entire story he'd built his life around. What if this decision wasn't about ending something at all? What if it was about finally facing what had been postponed for years? Because once the question formed in Harry's mind, what has this marriage actually given back? Everything shifted. Not outwardly, not at first, but internally, the ground moved. And when that happens, even familiar rooms start to feel unfamiliar. Even the life you built with intention begins to feel like it belongs to someone else. This is where people get it wrong. They assume divorce is an act of destruction, a failure, a collapse. But for many, it's a reckoning. A moment when the cost-benefit analysis of staying quietly outweighs the fear of leaving loudly. And for someone like Harry, whose entire life has been shaped by duty, image, and expectation, that realization carries a different weight. Ask yourself this. How do you walk away from a story you defended to the world without admitting you were wrong? That's the paradox. Leaving doesn't just change the future. It rewrites the past. It forces you to re-examine every sacrifice through a new lens. Were those choices freely made? Or were they made under pressure, adrenaline, and the belief that there was no turning back? There's another uncomfortable truth here. People don't usually leave relationships when they're angry. They leave when they're clear, when the fog lifts, when they stop trying to convince themselves. And clarity, for someone who has lived in emotional combat mode, can feel terrifying. Because clarity doesn't shout. It whispers. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. What Harry may be walking toward isn't fame or approval or even peace right away. It's uncertainty. It's grief mixed with relief. It's guilt layered over freedom. It's the realization that choosing yourself doesn't mean you never love the other person. It means you can no longer afford to disappear for them. There's a human detail people overlook. Loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from being unseen in the place you're supposed to be most known. And when that loneliness sets in, it doesn't ask for permission. It just grows, quietly, patiently, until one day, it outweighs the fear of change. And then there's identity. Harry didn't just marry a person. He married a cause, a narrative, a future that required constant reinforcement. Walking away from that doesn't just mean losing a partner. It means losing a version of yourself. The defender, the rebel, the man who sacrificed everything for love. Letting go of that identity may have been as painful as letting go of the marriage itself. So ask yourself this. If staying meant continuing to play a role you no longer believed in, was leaving really betrayal, or was it honesty arriving late? But here's where the story turns again. Because as Harry began to imagine a life beyond the marriage, another realization surfaced. One that made the decision irreversible. Something about how the past would look once the separation became public. About how certain choices, once reframed, could never be defended the same way again. And once that door opened, there was no way to close it. So we circle back to the question that opened this story. What if the man who once told the world he would protect his wife at all costs finally realized the cost was himself? Because when people heard the words, "I'm divorcing Megan," many assumed the story ended there. Headlines closed the book. Opinions hardened instantly. Sides were chosen within minutes. But the truth is, that sentence wasn't an ending at all. It was a confession. And confessions are rarely simple. For years, Harry's life has been defined by reaction. React to tradition. React to loss. React to pressure. React to criticism. React to expectations. And in that constant reaction, something subtle but devastating happened. He stopped choosing. He started enduring. And endurance, when mistaken for purpose, can quietly drain the life out of even the strongest commitment. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, because it forces a mirror on all of us. How many people stay in situations not because they're fulfilled, but because leaving would force too many explanations? How many defend choices long after those choices stopped feeling right? How many confuse loyalty with silence? Harry's announcement didn't just fracture a marriage. It fractured a narrative that millions had invested in. The idea that love alone could justify every loss. The idea that sacrifice automatically equals meaning. The idea that if you just hold on long enough, everything will eventually make sense. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes clarity arrives late. Sometimes self-preservation looks like betrayal from the outside. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't to fight harder, but to stop fighting altogether. That doesn't make this story clean or painless. or heroic in the way fairy tales demand. It makes it human, messy, complicated, full of grief and relief occupying the same space. Because walking away doesn't erase the love that existed. It simply acknowledges that love alone was no longer enough to sustain the weight placed on it. And here's the part no one can predict yet. This decision doesn't just reshape Harry's future. It reshapes how the past will be understood. Conversations will be reinterpreted. Interviews will be replayed. Moments once framed as strength may be reconsidered as warning signs. And that process has only just begun. So before you rush to judgment, ask yourself one final question. If you had built your entire life around proving a single choice was right, how hard would it be to admit that the choice had changed you in ways you never intended? Because this story isn't really about divorce. It's about identity. About the price of living inside a role for too long. About what happens when the mask finally becomes too heavy to wear. And if this announcement is Harry choosing himself for the first time in years, then the real question isn't what he's leaving behind. It's who he's about to become.